if we were to actually systematize the teaching of wisdom, if we were to actually think about what are the component parts, and rather than teaching somebody even a way of thinking, but actually multiple ways of thinking, and enable them to apply those ways again and again in context after context, you can actually begin the process of creating wise individuals among people who are much, much younger. We don't necessarily have to have the decades of lived experience to get to it by accident, because they have frameworks that they can build wisdom onto from the start. And that's effectively our entire educational philosophy.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Ben Nelson, who is the founder and chancellor of Minerva University. And he's going to share his thoughts on what's wrong with education. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and create harmony to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. Today's quote is from Mary Petitone Poole. To repeat what others have said requires education. To challenge it requires brains. This is what the episode is all about. The world has changed. Memorizing dates and formulas is useless when I have a computer in my pocket called an iPhone that's got Google on it and can answer those questions. Our school systems are training kids for a world that changed a long time ago. The average classroom hasn't changed in 100 years other than now they have digital displays instead of chalkboards. Before we continue, though, let's review last week's action step, which was to write down your epic goal and what step do you need to take? What is that first one, that tiny little step that's the hardest? Just taking it and then watch what the universe does and opens a path forward for you. So did you take the first step? Or are you waiting years like I did so many times to start things? You know, those are the regrets I look back at. I should have started sooner. It's your choice, and make the first step as easy as possible so you can take it without fear or effort. You know, that's another thing schools don't teach. They ask for compliance, not challenging the teacher. It's no wonder we are the way we are. The purpose of education should be to impart wisdom. We've lost that goal. I've spoken on this before. College is a game. And our education system is not teaching our kids for the world we live in. Look at the classrooms from 100 years ago, or even when you were a kid. Has it changed other than technology? Are the subjects taught the same? Did they teach you to think and to challenge, or to do what you're told? Do you even remember how to do what you were taught in school? Do you use that information in your daily life? You think I'm crazy? Why don't you watch Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader and see what happens? Let's face it, it's time to stop playing a broken game and create a different path. It's easier than ever today. And There's so many paths out there to choose from. Today, we've got a leader on from a different type of college to share what's wrong and how to fix it. The choice is yours. Ben Nelson is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Minerva Project and the Chancellor of Minerva University. Prior to Minerva, he spent more than 10 years at Snapfish, where he helped build the company from startup to the world's largest personal publishing service. With over 42 million transactions across 22 countries, nearly 5 times greater than its closest competitor. It was one of the top e-commerce services in the world, and he served as CEO from 2005 to 2010 and led the sale to Hewlett Packard for over $300 million. He then started Minerva in 2011 with the goal of nurturing critical wisdom for the sake of the world through a systematic and evidence-based teaching approach to learning. Over the past decade, he has built Minerva University into the most selective and effective university in the United States and has developed a business, the Minerva Project, to share Minerva's unique approach with other like-minded institutions. His passion for reforming education was first sparked at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, where he received a BS in economics. After creating a blueprint for curricular reform in his first year, the principles from which he drew to frame Minerva, he went on to become the chair of the Student Committee on Undergraduate Education, a think tank that is the oldest and only non-elected student government body at the University of Pennsylvania. These projects have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, The Guardian, The New York Times, EdSurge, Fast Company, and more. Let's meet Ben and hear his wisdom. Welcome to Rich Your Soul, Ben Nelson. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am excited to learn from you today because we're going to talk about wisdom. As always, though, we start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
It's a great question. So I grew up, I'm the son of scientists. So my father's a molecular biologist. My mother was a biology teacher, became a scientist later on in life. But they also grew up extraordinarily modestly. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. My father grew up before the state of Israel existed in a village. Before he went to university, quite by accident, he was going to be a shepherd. He was a sheep herder, and that was how he started. And so, needless to say, their relationship to money was not, let's say, frivolous. So I remember my very first lesson about money. You get little pocket changes as a kid, and we lived in an apartment above like a little corner market. Like it's not exactly, certainly not a supermarket, but a little market. And I had money really for the first time of my conscious life. And so I went down and I went to the store and I decided to buy a few trinkets. I bought like a little plastic sheriff star and things like that. And I came home and I showed my parents. I said, "Oh my God, look, this is what I got with my money." And they said, "First, why the heck did you spend your money? And you spent it on what?" and they basically they had none of the how cute and how nice. They said, you gotta, money is precious, and you gotta think about how you spend it and what you spend it on. What's the actual value of these things? How long are you actually going to be playing with them for? Are you going to get tired of them? What could you have done that's better? And, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, but I remember that conversation clearly to this day. It was, it hurt them to see me be wasteful in that way. And it was a great lesson.
It's funny because I did very similar with my kids. in that they would watch TV occasionally, and I'd be like, hey, you have that toy. Is it as cool as it is on TV? And they're like, no. And I'm like, all they want is your money. That's the whole purpose of this. Don't give them your money.
That's a great lesson. That's very, very smart.
I've always of the belief you can't play golf until you have a golf club, right? I don't care how many books on golf you read. Like, the kids won't learn money until they have money in their hands. And we knew we were going to be wealthy, and we had seen enough of problems where kids who grew up in wealthy families ended up with a lot of issues. And so we wanted them to appropriately learn how to have a good relationship with money and how to use it wisely. And so we were intentional all the way through. Unfortunately, most people aren't. And I'm guessing school didn't teach you much about money?
Not a thing. Except I will say, my fifth grade teacher, Mr. Laskowicz, it was the first year I was in the U.S. my third grade, and then we moved to the U.S. permanently when I was in fifth grade. Mr. Laskowicz always told us that whenever you pass by a payphone, and for those maybe younger in the audience don't know what a payphone is, or these phones that exist in public, you put a dime or a quarter in to make a phone call. He always said, every time you pass by a payphone, you have to check the bottom to see if there was any change that was returned, because it's free found money and you should always take some.
I remember doing that as a kid.
Absolutely. Ever since Mr. Laskowicz, every payphone you go by, you have to check.
We didn't worry about germs and all that stuff back then.
Right.
And there'd always be money, because sometimes they made change. In other words, you put in money to make a call and you didn't use up all your money, and it would put money back out after you left. Or sometimes you'd put money in and it would just go through and people just didn't pay attention. And, you know, back then, quarters and nickels and dimes were worth something. You could get candy.
That's
right. So it was a good, easy way to do that. Did you learn money later in life then, or?
It is interesting. I had a very strange relationship with money. I think in some ways, the lessons that my parents taught me translated extraordinarily well when I was dealing with other people's money. Because when I was running companies and running businesses, I was and continue to be extraordinarily frugal. And, just deeply, deeply thinking about every penny and where it goes, and everybody flies economy, including myself, and no matter where you're going anywhere in the world. And it was always about, the next dollar, and you have to think about how much money you're making and how much you're spending. And before you're profitable, how do you allocate it? Whereas with my personal money, I think similarly, kind of as a reaction to this, I was like, no, I want to enjoy it. I want to actually, now I didn't waste it, but for me, the lesson that I learned back then was, rather than buying the baubles and the trinkets and things like that, to me, it was all about experiences. I love great music. I love great food and great wine. And for me, it's like good use. When you put money like that to grow your experience, it's absolutely worth it. So I have a proclivity to really enjoy life as much as I can with whatever I can afford at any given time in my life, and sometimes beyond what I could have afforded when I was much younger. But when it comes to business, it's all about that kind of depression baby type of mentality, which is kind of an interesting dichotomy.
It is. It's funny how we behave very differently in our work business life and in our personal life. Yeah. And they don't always follow the same patterns. What I find is employees are kind of encouraged to spend money because you got to make budget. If we don't spend the budget. And so employees tend to spend like crazy without regards to it because it isn't theirs, and they can enjoy the expense account
And that's actually one of the big problems of running companies with this idea of spend to budget, right? And you have to create all sorts of incentives and boundaries where, yes, you want to have freedom to spend to budget, but you really want to demonstrate results by underspending budget. And you've got to align incentives to do that.
And that's the thing. Most companies don't underline incentives to, hey, if you can come in under budget and still produce results, we will reward you. And that's a big part of it. Most companies don't do that. And most business owners I have found have no idea where their money's going, and they don't always want to ask. And you spent time in the business world before you got into higher education. What caused you to, you were in charge of Snapfish, right?
Right.
And then you left Snapfish to go into higher ed. What caused that switch?
Well, it was really going back to it. When I was an undergraduate, I spent most of my time in college trying to fix my university. And there was not a particularly large constituency that was interested in that. The students didn't really go to Penn in order to learn anything. They went to get a certification. The professors weren't at the university to teach anybody. They were there to do research. And the administration couldn't really care less about learning or teaching. It wasn't part of what they were worried about day to day. And so when I was trying to say, well, aren't these institutions the institutions that are supposed to guarantee the functioning of our representative republic? Aren't they the institutions that are supposed to put or filter individuals into positions where they make decisions that impact the lives of other people, and where they really should approach things wisely? Don't we have a responsibility to teach systematic thinking to our students? Nobody disagreed, but nobody wanted to do anything about it. So I went from a very idealistic perspective of what a university should be doing to realizing that, if I spend my 4 years as an undergraduate and chair of the student committee in undergraduate education, student government, and all the committees and all the rest, and I couldn't make much progress, I figured, well, what the heck could I do? So I went back. When I graduated, I went into the business world. The commercial internet was just starting when I was an undergraduate. And I was able to see how you could take an idea. I mean, I joined Snapfish. I wasn't one of the founders. It was founded by 4 other entrepreneurs. But I was there pretty early on, since the second or third month. And I could see how you could take the kernel of an idea and grow into something really substantial. And after spending a decade there, including more than half that time running the company, I realized maybe I should be doing this in something that has real impact in the world. And that's how I brought that back to education.
And so when you say Penn, you were at Wharton.
Right.
So we're not talking about just an average university. We're talking about the best, right? One of the top universities.
That was why I went, because it was the best undergraduate business program in the world by quite a margin.
It's funny because I was listening to you on another podcast and you were talking about Ivy League students and what they learn in class. And I think the comment was nothing.
Right.
And this is
because we all know that. I mean, if we really, for any of people who may be listening who are skeptical and say, oh no, I learned so much in college. Just do this exercise. Imagine you have a magic envelope from which you can draw out any final exam that you got an A in college. And just be honest. What would you get taking that exam right now? It's just being presented to you this moment. Pretty much any honest analysis would admit that you'd flunk. I would flunk every single final exam that I got an A in college. And that's because we fundamentally did not learn. We crammed for a test, we passed what was on the test, and we forgot what was on the test. And that's not a particularly effective learning methodology.
It's not. That's why Are You Smarter Than the Fifth Grader? The fifth graders win, right? Because right. The world has changed. I mean, I understand at a point it was important to memorize facts, but today I have Google, right? If I need to know a fact, Google will tell me the answer. I don't need to know it. And I'm seeing that a lot with education as well. Kids aren't taught, they're taught what to think, not how to think.
That's right.
And it seems to be getting worse. Besides yourself, is there anyone making a big impact in either in secondary ed or in higher ed?
Well, you'll see more interesting folks doing things in secondary. Higher education really is a giant wasteland of certification, and it certifies something other than learning. The overwhelming majority of thoughtful individuals who are working in education really do it in the K-12 sector. I mean, so an example, you look at the Summit School Network, which is an amazing charter school network started by Diane Taverner in California. They've really done extraordinary work in trying to think about how do you teach students a set of habits of mind that they can apply and in other ways have a little bit of a wisdom-centered approach. But when it comes to higher ed, there are people who try different angles, but overwhelmingly, they still are stuck on this test and lecture based methodology. And sure, there are some professors that will go away from that, and really, exceptional individuals. But, if you're a student at a 10,000 undergraduate institution, what is the likelihood that you will get a professor that has that perspective? A, it's relatively low, and B, even if you do, so you'll have them for 1, 2, 3 courses out of the 30 some that you take. That doesn't make for an education, and that creates a fundamental problem in the system.
So you said these schools are certifying people. What is this? What are they certifying?
So that's really the funny thing, right? Because we have this bizarre belief as parents that all our kids need is some stamp on their forehead, and then they're set for life. But the funny thing is, as employers, we know that that's complete nonsense. Never, I would imagine, in any of your listeners' lives, professional lives, have they had the following interview. Hello, interviewee. Where did you go to school? Oh, I went to Stanford. You're hired. That has never occurred, right? It has never occurred, and I've never known a business owner or a business executive that is hired on that basis. I don't even know of a business owner that said, well, I'll only look at students with such and such background. The reality is that most of the elite universities, all they really do is present a neutral grounding for the applicant, because we all have met countless Ivy League graduates who are bozos. And we've met plenty of smart ones, right? But we've also looked at a lot of people saying, you went to that university? And we have to remind ourselves that, oh yeah, there are a lot of people that really don't deserve to be at those universities, right? And you interview them and you realize, boy, you'd be terrible at work, right? And so even though as employers, we know that what matters isn't the certification somebody has, but actually how well they can be systematic thinkers, what they can do with what they've learned, how they can work with others and cooperate and actually build things. As parents, we somehow suspend that judgment and say, no. I've got to get my kid into the highest ranked program, even if we know that program won't teach them a damn thing. And that's a real bizarre dichotomy.
I think the parents think it will teach them something. At least that's what I see. But
perhaps the pandemic helped them realize that that's no longer the case, right?
And that very well could be if they were paying attention to what was going on, right, whether or not that's the case or not. So we keep talking about wisdom. What does wisdom mean to you?
Wisdom is an odd term because first, we don't come across it very often. And when we do, we think about it as kind of a mystical idea, right? We think about somebody sitting at the top of a misty mountain, pontificating on in sayings that nobody understands, with the assumption that if people actually do understand what it is, it wouldn't be wise. It has to be mysterious. But when you really think about it, wisdom is just knowing what to do in a situation you've never encountered before. That's it. That's all that wisdom is. You are presented with a set of constraints or conditions, and because you can draw upon usually past experience, and this is how we usually encounter wisdom, you then say, oh, I've never been in this particular context or in this particular experience, but I can give you with a high level of likelihood or certitude what is the better course of action than not. It's not a black or white, it's a black and gray, right? Knowing what certainly would be a bad idea and being able to present an array of potentially good approaches. Now, the way wisdom is usually acquired, at least as we encounter it in the wild, is among people who've had a lot of experience. They've gone through life, have made mistake after mistake, usually the same kind of mistake, but in different contexts. And then their brain pieces it together and says, wait a second, I keep making that same mistake in work, in my relationships, in my political inclinations. It doesn't really matter. And they draw a thread. And then they become wise, at least in that part. But despite the fact that almost everyone we know who is wise has some years on them, we also know that the majority of people who have some years on them are not particularly wise, right? And when we do meet people who have a wisdom, it's quite different from one wise person to another. They don't all come to the same conclusions, don't all have the same ability to apply learnings in particular circumstances, primarily because they've acquired their wisdom by accident. But if you really think about it and say, wait a second, if we were to actually systematize the teaching of wisdom, if we were to actually think about what are the component parts, and rather than teaching somebody even a way of thinking, but actually multiple ways of thinking, and enable them to apply those ways again and again in context after context, you can actually begin the process of creating wise individuals among people who are much, much younger, who don't necessarily have to have the decades of lived experience to get to it by accident, because they have frameworks that they can build wisdom onto from the start. And that's effectively our entire educational philosophy.
So how do you do that?
So the first way is to create a language that enables individuals to see the connection between varying types of applications. I'll give you probably the easiest example I can think of. Imagine a doctor seeing a patient, and the patient walks into the room and the doctor says, take this medication. Now tell me what's wrong with you. And that seems very odd. And of course, no doctor would do it. No patient would do it, because every doctor on the planet, every patient on the planet knows that you need to diagnose the illness before understanding what medication you should take. Right? That is core understanding. Now imagine that same doctor that diagnoses illnesses 20 times a day for her entire career, goes home, and the garbage in the kitchen is overflowing. And she gets into it with her husband, right? And they fight. They fight about who shouldn't take the garbage out and all the rest. Now, how many doctors in that situation would say, wait a second, let's not fight. Let's understand what's at the root cause of the tension in our relationship and address that. Well, the reality is very few doctors would say that. But that is the same thing as diagnosing an illness, right? It's actually understanding what is the root cause of a problem as opposed to trying to address a symptom, right? And here doctors know in their profession that the only thing that matters is root cause. Yeah, you can alleviate symptoms if you want to, but you have to be conscious of the fact that you're alleviating symptoms, but you really want to fix root cause, root cause, root cause. But because they call it diagnosing an illness, they don't think about it in their interpersonal relationships. When they go to the ballot box and vote, they don't think about what is the root cause of homelessness. They'll oftentimes say, oh, address the symptom. They don't think about it that way because they don't have that connection. And so when we teach our students, we don't teach them to diagnose an illness or a disease. We teach them to think about what is the right problem. Because right problem can be done in interpersonal relationships, in politics, in business, in medicine, in health. And now you've created a taxonomy, an intellectual taxonomy, that enables you to apply it in different contexts or be wise in that way.
I hate to tell you this, doctors are educated in our standard education system. They are not looking for the root cause. They're like, oh, you had a heart attack because you have high cholesterol. Here's a pill for your high cholesterol. They don't say fix your diet and exercise, but they don't even know. They've never taken classes in physiology and nutrition to even understand what diet and exercise means.
Unfortunately, that's also true.
So my kids were classically educated. And I think that it sounds to me like what you're doing at Minerva is along the same lines as classical education.
Correct. Except that if you think about what classical education has done was to say, look, read the great books, and then hopefully abstract lessons from them that you then can ideally apply later on. The problem with that approach is that it creates a layer of abstraction that, again, some people get, but some people don't. And some people learn certain abstractions, but not others. And so what we do is we say, look, this is too important, right? There is a set of universal principles that every enfranchised citizen really should have at their fingertips. People need to understand the difference between a fact and a claim, a root cause and a symptom. You need to understand that there are second and third order effects and unintended consequences. You need to understand how to change what they say depending on the audience they talk to be effective, right? You need to understand the idea of emergent properties and how to apply statistical tools to various situations, etc. And rather than hoping that they figure that taxonomy out on their own and therefore get some subset of it, we skip that mystery part and then focus strictly on conceptual understanding and then contextual applications over and over and over again. Because one of the biggest challenges in education, really one of the things that has had very little evidence that educational institutions can do. In fact, a lot of evidence that educational institutions cannot, is this idea of far transfer, the idea of learning something in one context and applying it in a radically different context. And the great classical education programs of the past, like the Chicago core curriculum of the 1930s and 40s that is long extinct and very much not what the University of Chicago teaches now, but graduates of that program, and I've had the privilege of being mentored by a number of them, really had this idea of the habits of the mind, right? And having these types of ideas recur in their philosophy classes, in their science classes, in their math classes, and seeing those connections. And Minerva really takes it to that next level, using everything we know about the science of learning, about how the brain works, and actually creating a systematized approach to learning in that way.
And where my kids did secondary school, that was their whole philosophy. Today's episode is sponsored by Profit Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Profit Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. And where my kids did secondary school, that was their whole philosophy. Every class is tied together and every grade builds on the previous grade.
Exactly.
And it is a system that you have to kind of go through and create. And because of that, I know my kids are wiser. And a lot of people will say to me, your kids are so smart. And I'm like, no, they don't have a natural ability. They've just been trained well. And that training is what separates them. They've been taught how to think, how to understand, regardless of what the situation is. Okay, when I walk into this situation, there's a language to it. Let me understand the language. And then how do I make the references to other things? How do I understand human biases? How does this all come together? And then how do I apply logic to it to be able to do that? And that's how we came to learn about Minerva, because when my kids were going through the college application process, and we'll get to the SATs and all the business behind it, but at the moment you take the SATs, all of a sudden every college has your name, and we get 1 million pieces of mail, garbage bags full of mail. And my kids would look at these and they would say, they must all use the same marketing company because they all have the same marketing message with a different picture behind it, except for one, right? We got this one piece of mail and it was a logic puzzle. There was no name of a college. There was no mention of anything. Now, my kids we did this when they were kids. Like, they learned how to do logic puzzles. We would come up with those riddles, hey, if a plane crashes on the US-Canada border, where do they bury the survivors? And so they would start to realize how to think outside of the norm. And so they solved the puzzle, which put them to a second puzzle. And then they had to solve the second puzzle. And I think it wasn't until they solved the third puzzle that it said, hey, we're Minerva. We're looking for somebody like you.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It was you created a thing that you're wiping out all the people who are not interested, right? Because they're not going to solve the problem. Then you're wiping out the people who can't solve the problem, who haven't been. And now you're getting the best of the best. And most people have probably not heard of Minerva. It is a different way to do college. And by the time my daughter got that, she was so far into the process and committed that she's like, I'm not starting a whole new process. And I didn't blame her. But, at the same point, she's graduated now. She got out in 3.5 years and she was like, this is way too long. There is no reason we need to be here. You taught me everything I needed to know in a fraction of the time. And she went to kind of a quasi-classical school for her college, but it wasn't full on board with that. And she also didn't want to go to St. John's, which is truly classical, but she's like, I don't want to learn Latin. I don't want to, that wasn't of interest to her. So it's how do you make this interesting to people who it is? Now, you guys actually have a lower acceptance rate than Harvard and the Ivies, don't you?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because one of the reasons that many people have not heard about Minerva is that we do look for diamonds in the rough. Now, we get 25,000 applicants a year. But at the same time, we don't advertise. We don't send flyers with our name everywhere and all the rest, because we are looking for a very specific kind of student at our own university. We can talk later about the work we do with other universities to help them change. But at our own university, we really are trying to find those individuals who we want to see having the opportunity, we refer to it as have decisions of consequence, right? And those are making decisions that affect the lives of others more so than they affect your own. Those are the people that are in leadership positions. And people in leadership positions have to be selfless. They have to think about how to think systematically. They have to be able to have grace under pressure. And that is very much not the model of, hey, are you naturally high IQ? Good enough. That's all we need. Or worse, are you naturally wealthy? Well, that's really all we need. Hey, why don't you come on board? Right. And so we really try to find those types of individuals, not that are going to come in knowing what to do, because otherwise, why would we exist? But that have that curiosity, that drive, that passion that we could then educate into systematic thinkers. And that for us is crucial.
And I think that's one of the issues we have in politics today. We have zero systematic thinking. That's right.
And I'll give you my one of the key things that I use as an example of what the power of a Minerva education is really all about, right? So I mentioned one of the things that we teach our students is this idea of changing what you say depending on the audience that you're talking to. Because if you want to be effective, one of the key things to understand is it doesn't really matter what you intend to say. What matters is what people hear, right? And as you said, people have their own cognitive biases and their own lenses. And if you are really focused on being an effective human being, a leader, a colleague, a partner, it doesn't really matter what approach, you really have to speak in a way such that people hear your intent and you think about the impact that you have on them, because they're not going to think about your intent. Now, some people say, well, hey, that's a good lesson and that's a lovely approach, but boy, how do you transfer that, right? How do you think about that? I mean, that's a very straightforward concept, thinking about an audience. And sure, you could talk about it in speaking or writing or giving a presentation, but that's not really a far transfer. Maybe that's a near transfer. But one of the ways to really think about it, and the Minerva students that really master this idea, both understand that when they speak to others, the only thing that matters is how they feel about what you say. But when you yourself are the audience, the only thing that matters is what they intend, not what you feel. Because just like you have to be cognizant of the fact that other people are going to have their biases and they're not going to allow you to be effective if you impact them negatively. Similarly, if you want to be effective and you're negatively impacted by your own biases, you take somebody with good intentions and you malign them for no reason, simply because they're not artful in what they say or how they say it. Now think about our society today. Our society today has the exact opposite position on both of these points. You have one camp of people that say, I'm going to say whatever I want and I don't care who I offend, tough. And then you've got another group of people that says, I don't care what anybody intends. The only thing that matters is how I feel, right? And if you have that perspective, society will collapse, right? It doesn't work at all. Instead, you should have the exact opposite perspective from both, which is to say, why would I say inflammatory things because I'm lazy? Well, you have the other side saying, why would I succumb to the interpretive lens that I have, as opposed to really have open inquiry and understand where somebody's coming from? Right? And that element of transferring, not just in thinking about you as a deliverer of a message in audience, but a receiver of one, that is the ultimate instantiation of wisdom. And you do that again and again in cognitive tool or learning concept after the other.
I think that was one of the best things my daughter did in college was debate. Because she was forced to take both sides of any argument because you didn't get to choose. You were like, here's an argument. Here's the side you're going to pick. Now create the argument around that and define its parameters. And you have to listen to what the other side says, because you're constantly challenging them from a logical standpoint, I guess. I didn't go see all of the debates, but I know that really helped her as a person to grow and to develop some of those skills. So much more practical. So let's kind of take a step back, because I want people to start really understanding the college game. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is that there is a formula behind college rankings.
Yeah.
What's the formula?
Formula is really straightforward. Reject as many students as possible, hire as many professors as you can per student, and spend as much money per professor as you can. Now, that may sound lovely to some parents to say, wow, if I get my kid in, they're going to be branded as super selective. They're going to have all this personalized attention from all these professors. And boy, think of all the resources those professors have. So that sounds like a wonderful situation. But here's the problem. Universities don't spend that money on education. In fact, with all of these low student-faculty ratios, bizarrely, the majority of classes that students take at universities are large lectures. You have to think about it and say, wait a second, how is it that a university has a 10-to-1 student-faculty ratio, yet 70% of the classes that students take at the same institution have 50 to 200 people per class? That doesn't make any sense. And the reason for that is that many of these professors don't teach. They actually get the money that is spent on them is to spend on research, right? And all of the prestige of universities come from research. And here is the dirty secret, which is that there is a negative correlation between how research-oriented a professor is and the learning outcomes of their students as undergraduates. Adjunct professors, the ones that get paid less and are maligned in the rankings and all the rest, have better learning outcomes than tenured research professors. Right? That's because that's their job, it's to teach. Whereas for the research professors, teaching is an annoyance. It gets in the way of their actual career. And so the entire formula is broken from an educational perspective, and it incentivizes universities to actually create educationally averse environments.
And so those classes are taught by teaching assistants.
All too often.
My son's a junior in college. He's a teaching assistant.
Right.
I don't know what classes he teaches, but hey, they're paying him, so whatever.
And they get paid the dollars, and the students pay a lot of dollars for that privilege of being taught by somebody who's a year or two older than they are. And this really is, look, and by the way, these formulas are such, I don't know if you saw this recently, but there was recently a research paper that demonstrated that Columbia University lied when it submitted its information to U.S. News and World Report by a lot, right? So U.S. News and World Report asks, well, what percentage of your classes have fewer than 20 students? And Columbia inflated that number by a significant amount. And the reality is that even when you see universities like Columbia claim, even though they don't have 80% of their classes have less than 20 students per class, again, this is a bit of a math puzzle, which is if 80% of your classes have less than 20 students, let's say 10 on average, yet 20% have more, let's say 100 on average, the majority of classes that you take as an undergraduate are going to be large classes because the amount of credits that the university issues in large classes is much larger than the number of credits they issue in small classes. And so when universities lie about their statistics to game the rankings, and even with the lying statistics, they still demonstrate that you don't get a personalized education. That's a problem. And by the way, many of the small classes, I remember I took a class at College of Arts and Science at Penn on Dostoevsky. It was a 12-person class on Dostoevsky. Lecture. The professor came in and lectured to the 12 of us. We didn't say a word the entire semester. And by the way, like a good, Russian literature scholar, he was also completely and utterly drunk every time he came to class. And my favorite part, just to show you what a professional this man was, he was giving us a lecture, one of Dostoevsky's novels, and he was sitting in his chair, kind of leaning back, speaking very slowly through slurred speech, and halfway through a sentence, he fell asleep. And the 12 of us were looking at each other. We didn't know what to do. A few left the room. A few put their heads down and started sleeping. A couple of us were reading the book since we didn't do the homework because there was no point in doing the homework because he was lecturing the whole time. And 12 or 15 minutes later, he wakes up and finishes the sentence. Right? So to me, that's a professional drunk, right? That's somebody who knows what he's doing.
So I had a college professor like that in our futures class. He was going on and on about how to do futures. And back then, we just decided to play along. So we would get these wrappers that said Pepsi, and we'd put them around our beer cans and we go to class and drink with them. You're going to have fun. You might as well enjoy, right? But, we weren't in an Ivy League school. We're at a state school. That's just the way things happen. And I knew that the education was BS to begin with. I went there because I was told this is what you have to do. And so I did it. But it's absurd what happens. And to be honest, if that's what you're going to teach, YouTube does it much better.
Absolutely.
Right? And why don't you go watch YouTube? And honestly, I take courses. Even my kids have taken courses out of the Ivy Leagues because they put them up on Coursera. And you can go learn from somebody who actually knows what they're doing and enjoy it.
Absolutely. You can go at your own pace. You can pause. You can rewind. If you forget something, you can go back. Information dissemination is no longer the role of university degree programs. Universities still play an important role in creation of information, in creation of knowledge and research, and in dissemination. Publishing includes putting courses on YouTube, etc. That's a public good. Everybody should have access to it. Hallelujah. That is not an education. It doesn't make you wise, as you've said, just to acquire information or be able to look up information. You got to know what you can do with it, right? And that's the baseline that real education has to be built on top. And that is where you need social learning, where you need an expert and a group of peers struggling with an idea, thinking about the black and the gray, right? And saying, how do we distinguish between certainly bad approaches to potentially good approaches? And that's really what an education is about. And overwhelmingly, there are professors that will do that, but overwhelmingly, universities don't have that mentality, certainly from a programmatic.
They do. And that's what's kind of given me this new refound respect of philosophy, because philosophy by its very nature forces you to think. And you can't just get away with it. So let's take a step back. There's another game being played on parents in high school, and that's the whole SAT game. So what's up with that?
The SAT is one of a number of really game-like aspects of the college application, because the reality is that almost every aspect of the college application really asks only one question, which is, how rich are you? The SATs are more highly correlated with wealth than they are with IQ. The pre-written essay is more correlated with wealth than the SATs are, right? Imagine you are a first-generation student going to college being asked, write, page 417 of your autobiography. That's a pretty odd question to ask somebody who doesn't know anybody who's gone to college. Yet, if you have a college consultant on payroll and your parents wrote that same essay 30 years ago to get into their college, you got a bit of a leg up, right, to put it mildly. They ask you on the college application, what high school did you go to? 200 high schools in the United States are responsible for 50% of the students in the Ivy League. You want to guess which zip codes those 200 high schools are from? Then, just to make sure, the college will ask you where your parents went to school, where your aunts and uncles went to school, where your grandparents went to school, where your siblings have gone to school. Then, just to be absolutely sure, they're going to ask you, hey, do you, by the way, play, water polo? Do you sail? Do you play golf? Do you play squash? Do you play lacrosse? Right? All of these things to ensure that, they leave no stone unturned. And just to be absolutely sure, if you have no ability to pass any of those other tests, pretty much any university, including Harvard, including Stanford, will say, look, if you just pay us $50 million, we'll admit your idiot child, right? And they will. They will. So I'll give you a couple of statistics that people are stunned by. When Stanford first reached 5% admissions rate, the admissions rate for applicants of children on the Stanford donor watch list. So this is a multi-thousand person list that is curated by the hundreds of donor officers at Stanford. The admission rate of the students applying from that list that year, general acceptance rate at Stanford 5%, donor watch list 57%. 57%, right? That's worse than most state schools. Harvard has a thing called the Z list. The Z list are individuals that cannot qualify by any stretch of the imagination to be Harvard undergraduates, but mommy and daddy built a building. And so these students are admitted and they're not allowed to enroll in the first year. So they have to enroll a year later, because then those students are considered transfer students and they don't show up on the federal reporting. So Harvard doesn't have to admit that some of their students come in will destroying their statistical average. And so then these institutions twist themselves into pretzels trying to admit and be inclusive of others that don't really belong. And in order to pretend like, these criteria make sense, they have to scream at the top of their lungs how inclusive they are of others, right? So that people don't actually look and see, oh, wait a second, most of the people that you admitted in that first bucket, they actually are the ones that don't belong, right? And that creates a real kind of rot in the higher education enterprise. If I were to be able to wave a magic wand, I think that the rankings should be really, really simple. People look at salaries of graduates, which of course is a very crude measure, right? Because some people want to become teachers, they want to do nonprofit work, they want to become thinkers and artists, and those are wonderful and noble pursuits, and they shouldn't be penalized for that. But if you're going to use salary as a measure, you can use graduating salaries 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, doesn't really matter. Except you have to divide that salary by the household net worth of the parents. And if you did that, Stanford would be the worst university in the world. Horrendous. It would be social, downward mobility, as would all the Ivies. Because when you take millionaire families, right, which is the majority of the students in highly selective universities, and you say, oh, look at these amazing outcomes for students that had those outcomes before they even matriculated, because they're basically guaranteed that outcome. It brings in a stark question why it is that these institutions command the adulation that we give them.
One of the things that upsets me the most, and I told my kids, I don't care if you get into Ivy League, I'm not paying for it. So unless they're cutting you a deal, we're not going, is the fact that because they keep raising their prices, everyone else, and this is another dirty secret of colleges set their price in accordance with that because they say, oh, if Harvard's 80 and I'm 20, people are going to think we're not worth it. So we have to say we're 55 and then we'll give scholarships out to these people. And it turns into a whole nother game. And I'm just waiting for the whole thing I told both my kids, if you don't want to go, don't go. I would really push my son, but he's like, I'm going to be a software engineer. This is chump change to pay for whatever, for the stamp of approval.
Well,
and it's true.
The beauty of it. We don't play that game. We charge $30,000 a year for tuition fees, room and board. And it's not subsidized. We're not a public college, right? We're just like Harvard or Stanford, a private nonprofit. And half of that cost, you can't get around. It's the cost of being alive. It's food, it's the cost of housing, etc. But tuition and fees of less than $20,000, right, compared to the $60,000 of the tuition and fees at other universities, I mean, it's astonishing. And 100% of our classes have fewer than 20 students. So you get that kind of personalized attention, and we have better outcomes, graduation outcomes than the Ivy League, despite having a socioeconomically diverse student body. And so the reality is a family that can afford to pay for that, $80,000 a year, they could buy themselves a new Tesla, buy their kid a Tesla, and save money and get a better education, right? And the reality is that even though Minerva is just one example, you're going to start seeing more and more institutions, many of which that we are helping set up, both programs within existing universities as well as new institutions that are going to start offering a lot more students the opportunity to get that kind of education at that kind of a price.
So how do people know if where they're looking can do that for their kids?
Well, the first thing is you look at what is the curriculum on offer, and don't look at the marketing. Don't look at at what the brochures say. Actually look at the course of study. And if the course of study is, here's a list of 100 courses, you pick 2 out of this list, and you pick 2 out of another list, you're not getting an education, right? You're basically throwing darts at a board, hoping that maybe one of the 10 professors you get will actually care about it, right? The shortcut is to actually see, is the program a Minerva program? Is it designed either at Minerva University or is it designed by Minerva at other institutions? So for example, we're building a new honors program at the University of Miami. They're about to celebrate their centennial. They're launching a new century college. And we're working alongside with them to define what that new century perspective on education will look like. It will be more efficient, shorter, right? A 3-year program as opposed to a 4-year program, dramatically higher quality with these types of habits of mind and foundational concepts, these learning objectives that are going to be the taxonomy across that learning. We're working with universities all over the world in doing things like that, not just all over the United States. And so there's a way that when you need to interrogate what it is that the school has on offer from a curricular perspective, then you see, how are they going to teach our students? Is it going to be a lecture, or are they actually going to engage them in seminar? Are they connected to real world applications, et cetera?
It's funny, when we went looking at colleges, one of the things we did was show me the classroom and show me the seating arrangement.
Yeah.
Are there less than 20 desks? And are they all facing forward, or are they facing in such a way that we can have a conversation?
Exactly.
And so that was just part of the way that we looked at things. I'm going to be blunt with people. Kids who go through a system like this are going to crush your kids. So unless you're multimillionaires and you're going to leave them tons of money and baby them, you have to really start thinking about this, because the world of education is changing. What was good enough yesterday is irrelevant today. And these kids are going to come out, and wherever they go, they're going to crush life, because we are in an ever-changing world. And what you're teaching in a classroom, if it's just that subject, is most likely going to become irrelevant in 10 years. And if you don't know how to adapt and change, you're screwed. And that's why I'm passionate about this.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we always like to get people to take action. What is something people can do this week to take a step forward, either in their lives or their kids' lives?
Well, look, I think there are a number of things. First and foremost, advocate for reform and for change. There's nothing more powerful than calling your alma mater and saying, here's a donation that I was going to make, but instead I'm funding a scholarship at Minerva for a deserving child, and you're not getting that money because you're not actually serving students well. Because it's one thing to just support the institution, which is lovely and all the rest, but much more important is to get that message across that the status quo is not okay. It's not acceptable. That as an alum or as a supporter, you're fed up with seeing what is happening with higher education and how it's not adapting to the times. So I think that's one core area. The second is work with your children. Talk to them about what the world actually is like. Get them out of this mania of going to college or going to this particular college is the determination between your success or your failure in life. It's nonsense. Harvard has run a 60-year study, 60 years, which demonstrates that unless you came from the bottom quintile of the socioeconomic distribution, which is 3% of the Harvard entering class, it's an irrelevant number, it doesn't matter. For any student that was accepted by Harvard, it doesn't matter if they went to Harvard, if they went to another private university, went to a state school, their outcomes in life were identical. Harvard research has proven that Harvard's value add for 90+% of their students is zero, right? And if there's empirical evidence at that, and if Harvard doesn't add value, do you think Dartmouth adds value? Do you think that the next tier, right, from a branding perspective, forget it. So talk to your kids and work with them to understand that what matters is their learning, not their stamp, not that certification. It's how they think, how they approach life, and how focused they are on wisdom.
I think that's excellent advice. And that is what we did with our kids from the age of probably 3 or 4, where we constantly were about learning to educate, learning how to learn. And we followed an extremely different path through this. And back then, I didn't know what the outcomes would be. There was no internet to tell me I was right or wrong. But as I sit here now, hands down, we know that we took the right path. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Acceptance that the gray, the ability to see that there are multiple pathways to potentially correct answers is really the secret to effective interactions.
Yeah, there is no one way. There's a million paths and no one right path is right or wrong. That's why I hate the way they teach math. Oh, you got the right answer, but you didn't follow our path. Well, who cares? Right. There's better paths,
exactly.
Right? This one should be right up your alley. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, by the way, we ask this of everyone, yeah. What would it be?
When I was 18, I was about to go to college. My father is a man of very few words, said to me, you know, Ben, we're very, very proud of you. But we're most proud of you when you come to us and you ask us for a piece of advice, and we tell you, do X, not Y. And you say, wow, that's really good advice. And then you do the opposite. The ability to make your parents proud by not listening to what they say, I think is the best piece of wisdom that you can have, which is, how do you enable confidence by the people who love you the most, that you can come to a better conclusion because you understand your circumstances than they can for you?
That's powerful. If people would like to learn more about Minerva and what you do, what's the best place for them to do that?
If you're interested in the university, go to minerva.edu. Some of our work with other institutions at minervaproject.com. And you can follow us on Twitter, Minerva University, at Minerva Project, on Facebook and other platforms.
And I'll put that all in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you again for having me.
So what are you going to do? Let your kids fall behind or step up and do something different? Many people are taking a different path. They just don't talk about it because of societal pressure to conform. And honestly, it's not worth their energy. They just go quietly. And that's fine. Go quietly, but go. I've found it's too hard to move institutions stuck in their ways. I think COVID has opened up a lot of eyes as to the problems in education. Our employers are complaining about the quality of graduates, and the future of work is going to change the way things are. People who can't think and adapt in a world that is ever changing at a faster pace are going to get left behind. I warned you. This week's action step: challenge your alma mater about improving their education. Let them know your money is going to follow your words and you're going to support education that brings about change. The other thing is, teach your kids about life and what really matters. That's what I did for my kids. And when I was doing it, I wasn't sure about the outcome, but today more and more, I see it was the right choice. Seriously, your kids will probably make next to no money playing sports. So why not play a game that actually pays? The game of life, of critical thinking. Take the time to practice how to think in an ever-changing world and figure out what's really true versus hype and spin. It's a major skill everyone wants, is critical thinking, and the schools are not teaching it. My son spent time in robotics instead of focusing on sports. The results are already coming in. He's got multiple scholarships, summer internship offers from the top tech companies, the biggest ones that are household names. The money is incredible. And I got to tell you, the odds were a lot better than the 1,000, whatever, million X to ever make it in making any kind of money playing sports. So I ask you a question. Who do you know with kids who needs to hear this message? Will you share it with them? I would very much appreciate that. Next week, we've got Ed Combs on to talk about the healthy love and money way. Basically, it's how do you chat with your spouse about money? How do you deal with those financial and emotional relationships within your family? I know you'll enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.